Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled The Roots of the Revolt of the Black Athlete. And our guest tonight is Johnny Smith from Georgia Institute of Technology. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. On behalf of Libby, Mike, Josh, Carly, and Hannah, I want to welcome you to tonight's session. This will be our last before the holidays. Of course, all of you are working above board and more than likely you ever have before in the pandemic and in the all the different disruptions that we have had in our world. We really appreciate the work that you're doing and the fact that you would join us at the end of a long work day. We're hopeful that tonight's session will be relevant and give you lots of different insights that you can share with your students. In particular, I want to thank Kate from Regis University for being with us tonight, as well as Aspen from Walton High School and Shaquana from Meredith College in nearby Raleigh, North Carolina. It's always nice, by the way, too, to see colleagues from the same school or the same building join us. I'm not sure if Teresa Hughes Elementary School is face-to-face or virtual right now, but it's always nice to see Victor and Abigail be able to unite and join each other in this professional development evening. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina. And right now, we, like many of you, are struggling to maintain as much normalcy as we can in support of our fellows, but also to follow a very strict public health protocol so we can all defeat and get past this pandemic. One of the things that is notable in the scholars who attend the center and the work that they do is they really enjoy, they look forward to offering their authority and their expertise on contemporary issues. I think you'll find tonight's session might be qualified as extracurricular more than curricular, meaning it's not necessarily true that you'll teach this in your curriculum. It's not at a standard, but all of your kids are talking about this. They're impacted by this. They're thinking about it. And hopefully tonight's session will give you a lot of different resources and insights that you can share, perhaps just in conversation, or if you decide to build it into your curriculum, finding ways to offer a classical perspective of these contemporary questions. And ultimately, I think that's probably what the humanities are intended to do. The Humanities in Class Digital Library is the platform where you can find all of the resources we'll share with you tonight, including a recording of tonight's session and the corresponding PowerPoint. If you go to the digital library at any time, you can use it as a card catalog, search and find relevant resources that are appropriate for both this topic and others. That includes a recording of the session we did with Professor Smith last spring on Jackie Robinson and his role in the civil rights movement. You can also, though, find resources from other organizations that have contributed to the library, make their resources free and publicly available in fair use Creative Commons copyright for educators to use at all levels. So I do hope that you spend some time investigating that and that it becomes one of your go-to places to find humanities education resources. Being able to search and find as discoverable resources from the American Historical Association or New American History, Civil Rights Movement veterans, or the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis only magnifies and amplifies their value because you can find them in one place and then also work to contribute your own resources. I would also encourage you to join the group for the webinar series. Again, this is where you can find resources both leading up to a live session like tonight, the pre-readings or the materials that have been shared. Professor Smith put many different articles in the library that hopefully you've had a chance to review, and if not, you can use to support what we talk about tonight. And again, this is where you'll find the recordings of the sessions. Take a look at upcoming webinar series. You'll notice that we have probably about 30 left, maybe 28 left before the end of April. We do add sessions on a somewhat regular basis. So if you've gone through and you've signed up for sessions of interest, you might check back in and just see if there are other sessions that now not only are interesting to you, but maybe you have the time to join us. Many of these sessions do feature past fellows at the National Humanities Center, and others we invite lead experts and scholars in their fields to spend time with us. I'd also encourage you to consider an online course. If each webinar earned you 5 professional development hours, a online course would get you 35 hours. And these are approved in 17 states right now, including Los Angeles Unified for salary points. This is a way to spend more time in an immersive setting, doing about 3 to 5 hours of work per week. So essentially, it's like attending 5 webinars in terms of the credit you might get. We have 10 courses that we offer on a regular basis. We've already started the fall courses, but we're still accepting registration until this weekend. So please do consider joining us for those. And then finally, I would like to thank, as always, my Teacher Advisory Council. This 20-person council is instrumental in helping us review our work and make it applicable for the classroom. I see several of our current members in the room tonight, and I want to thank them for their hard work and contributions, even in this virtual space. The webinar tonight will be audio only, as well as a PowerPoint that Professor Smith has created. Please do note that there are tabs at the top of the screen that allow you to go to other sites simultaneously. This will not disrupt the presentation, but make sure that you're back on slides when you want to view and see the slides that we're presenting. Please also notice that there is a tab for Help Desk. This is just some tips and tricks that we've discovered over the last 10 episodes that you might try if you're having a problem with the audio or the visuals. I hate to say it, I wish technology didn't work this way, but oftentimes just simply logging out and coming back in will resolve that issue. So take a look at that tab too, and if you have any kinds of issues with tonight's session. Again, you've for the National Humanities Center webinar series titled The Roots of the Revolt of the Black Athlete. And I'm joined by Johnny Smith, the Julius C. Budall Professor of Sports History at the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Tech. Hey, Johnny, I think you're with me in Atlanta. How are you tonight?
I'm good. It's great to be with you all. I appreciate you having me.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. And, as we did last spring, I'm going to turn the microphone and the slideshow over to you. I'm going to be, as a moderator, watching the chat box and the moderator questions. And occasionally I might interrupt you with a clarifying comment or question or a question from the audience. But before we begin, I wonder if you don't mind reflecting on the prompt that I gave as an opening question tonight. You know, you teach in Atlanta, you teach at Georgia Tech, big ACC school. Athletics is important. Of course, the WNBA team in Atlanta has very much been in the news about their own social activism. When you work with students at Georgia Tech, how do they respond to professional athletes making social statements on a regular basis?
You know, it's a great question. And I teach a number of courses in sports history, big lecture class, then some seminars with smaller groups of students. And in all those settings, you know, the questions that they ask have a lot to do with wanting to know, where did this come from? You know, they want to try to understand, well, how is it that in this age that they've grown up, where they recognize LeBron James and Colin Kaepernick and Serena Williams, you know, this seems almost normal to a lot of late teens and college students who are coming of age at a time when it's common for African-American athletes to engage social justice issues. But as they discover in my classes, it has not always been this way. On the one hand, as we'll learn tonight and we'll talk about, in the late 60s, there was this movement known as the Revolt of the Black Athlete, where an unprecedented number of Black athletes became engaged in the civil rights struggle and the Black Power movement. But then there was this lull where, beginning in the mid to late 70s and through the 80s and then in the 90s, many of the most prominent Black stars were not engaged in activism. So one of the things I try to stress to them is that the political activism that we see today and what we witnessed in the late 60s, it was shaped by a profound racial crisis in America. It was shaped by the broader history of African-American activism, movements of radical politics as well as the Black Power movement in the late 1960s, which we can compare in some ways to the Black Lives Matter movement today. So I really try to explain to them that the activism of these athletes does not occur in a vacuum. It's not isolated from our larger political culture or our larger racial history. And so that's, you know, those are some of the main themes that I want to discuss tonight. And it's something that I stress when I engage my students when we talk about these things.
Great, thank you for that comment. And it's you're absolutely right. Nothing is in a vacuum, and there's context. There's all the other sort of layers of culture and sort of present day issues that both your students, our audience's students are responding to, but also the athletes themselves. And we're anxious to learn more about those origins tonight.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm going to get started here with my first slide. So as you mentioned, Andy, we are living in a moment that for many Americans feels unprecedented in terms of the number of athletes at the pro level, the college level, the high school level becoming engaged in social justice movements, supporting Black Lives Matter, and making a variety of demonstrations. And we can talk at the end of the webinar about what I think is different about this era from the late 1960s. But I thought it'd be useful for many of our history teachers to think about the origins of Black athletic activism. When did this really become a turning point in American history? And so I want to start with this image that I'm sure many of our teachers are familiar with, and maybe many of you know about the two men who are standing on the victory stand at the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games. Tommie Smith in the center, the gold medal winner in the 200 meters, and John Carlos, his teammate, who took the bronze. And you can see them both standing there, each of them with a black leather glove on their fist. Their medals draped around their neck. They're wearing their Team USA uniform. And so I start with this image because it's a powerful image on the one hand. The image came to represent not just what became known as the Revolt of the Black Athlete, but also the Black Power movement. But the fact is that many of my students, and most Americans for that matter, they might recognize this image, but they often know little about the history behind it and know little about the men in that picture. But this was a controversial moment where Tommie Smith and John Carlos made what became known as a Black Power salute as the national anthem played at the 68 Games in Mexico City. It occurred also after, for much of that year, there was discussion among Black Olympians about whether or not they should protest or even boycott the Olympic Games that year in protest against racism in America. So what I want to do today is talk about how this demonstration by Tommie Smith and John Carlos was not a solitary act by two Black militants. Rather, this moment evolved out of an organizing campaign known as the Olympic Project of Human Rights, and that it also evolved out of the broader history of African American activism, the Black Power movement, and the radicalization of American politics during the 1960s. So we're going to go through that course, talk about that evolution, how we got to this picture. So one of the things I want to start here is frame our conversation, just to make clear that we all understand that this revolt of the Black athlete in the late 1960s marked the first serious and sustained challenge to the idea that sports are inherently positive and a progressive racial force. Because despite claims from many Americans that sports are or should be free of politics, the reality is they are not. I think what we'll also learn tonight is that we cannot divorce the history of American sports from the history of racial oppression. And that is why never before in the late 1960s had so many African American athletes use their platform to challenge racial prejudice and discrimination in sport and outside of sport. This is the story of a new generation of Black athletes who believed they had to do something more than succeed on the field to help Black America. And I also think that it's a story about what it means to be an American and what it means to be patriotic. So let's move ahead. Starting with this picture of Jackie Robinson and three of his white teammates. As many of you know, Robinson broke the color line in Major League Baseball in 1947 when he joined the Dodgers. At the top of this slide, I have this phrase, muscular assimilation. And that idea of muscular assimilation comes from the Black community, that in the age of Robinson in the 1940s and the 1950s, this era of racial integration in sports, many Black activists and writers believed that if Black athletes could integrate the sports world, hence muscular assimilation, then that model of racial cooperation could be applied outside of sports. And it would inspire whites to join the civil rights struggle, to support black causes. But the fact is that by the 1960s, the large presence of black athletes on American sports teams was so common that it was no longer noteworthy unless it was happening on Southern university teams that were previously segregated. Now, the fact is that integrated sports teams in the NBA, in the NFL, and Major League Baseball, it no longer signaled racial progress for African Americans. Perhaps for many whites, it signaled that the racial conflicts of the country had been resolved because they could point to sports teams and say, look, a black man has just as good a chance of playing in Major League Baseball as a white man. But it's in the late 1960s that many black athletes recognized that participating in sports, even on a highly successful level, either as a college athlete or an Olympian or as a pro athlete, it did not liberate them as an individual, and it did not liberate the larger black community. So let me explain why that is and how that change took place. So on this slide, we have a number of images. On the far right, we see these police dogs attacking young black demonstrators in Birmingham. We see another image in Birmingham as well, below that, of black children marching in the city. Birmingham, of course, was known as the most segregated city in the South, and in the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference go to Birmingham to launch a desegregation campaign that proved pivotal in the civil rights struggle. So many of you as teachers, I'm sure, that you teach this moment. You talk about how Birmingham was a site of open warfare between these nonviolent civil rights demonstrators and white supremacists, and how these events were broadcast throughout the country as a result of television. Well, the other image on this screen is Sam Cooke, a black celebrity, famous singer, who was inspired by the courage of black activists in the South. And he would go on to write a famous song, a civil rights anthem known as "A Change Is Gonna Come." And a major hook of that song was, "It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come." It's a song that trembles along the lines of patience and impatience, hope and despair, optimism and frustration, but it ultimately foreshadowed a growing determination to overcome oppression. And we see that determination grow in the aftermath of Birmingham. In fact, the Pittsburgh Courier, a black newspaper, most widely circulated black newspaper in America, wrote in the aftermath of the Birmingham campaign, quote, "If ministers and people of other professions and even children can take part in protest demonstrations and sit-ins and subject themselves to police dogs and fire hoses as well as arrests, then Negro athletes could at least lend their active support for the campaign for racial justice." It's a profound editorial. The Pittsburgh Courier is calling for black athletes to join the movement. And guess who does? Bill Russell. Bill Russell may not have been the first black player in the NBA, but he was certainly the first black star in the NBA, joining the Boston Celtics in 1957. And Russell's important. I mean, he was a dominant figure in the NBA. For all of you NBA history buffs, you may know he won 11 championship rings. He was an incredible force on the court. But it's off the court that I think he made his mark, most importantly. Here you see this image on the right, where he's marching with civil rights activists in 1963 at the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, Russell was probably the tallest demonstrator at the Washington Mall that day. He even spoke to Martin Luther King on the eve of the march. He refused to sit on the dais with the other civil rights leader because he didn't think it was appropriate. He didn't think he had earned that right. But in the aftermath of the March on Washington, which was a march for jobs and a march for freedom, it was an integrated march, Russell questioned the leadership of King and other civil rights leaders. He thought they had made a mistake by inviting white people to join them in this march. And the reason was he felt that by inviting whites, it diminished the powerful potential of black unity. You see, the core tenets of the Black Power movement, which would become a powerful slogan in the late 60s, was racial pride, self-determination, and the independence of Black people. Russell was someone who believed that Black folks could not let white people define them or their movement. And in fact, he, as 1963 and 1964 unfolded, he questioned nonviolence as a strategy. He questioned integration as a goal, and he questioned Martin Luther King's leadership. He said, if this nonviolence strategy doesn't work, then what will we do? We have to be willing to protect our families by any means necessary, quoting Malcolm X. And it wasn't just that he was participating in the civil rights struggle off the court. He also questioned the liberal assumptions about sport being racially progressive. He talked about how he believed that NBA owners had a quota system that limited the number of Black players who could be on each team. So really, Bill Russell is really a pivotal figure, a central figure in the beginning of the revolt of the Black athlete. But he was one of a very select few professional athletes who were so successful, so important to their teams, to their franchises, that they could afford to speak out at a time when most Black athletes didn't feel like they could or didn't choose to do so.
Johnny, may I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So Bill Russell, representing the city of Boston, one of the first athletes, as you're noting here. What was the reaction to Bill Russell individually by teammates, by the owners, by others? How did people respond to him in this role?
The Celtics are fascinating. They were an integrated team. They had probably they were the first team in the NBA, I believe in 1966, to start 5 Black players. Russell would replace Red Auerbach as head coach in 1966. He was player coach at that time, and so the ownership clearly drafted and signed what they believed or who they believe were the best players. And the Celtics were seen, I think, in the Black community as a model of racial cooperation. However, Russell was someone who had a strained relationship with the white sports writers in Boston, with white sports fans. And a big reason for that was the fact that he heard racial epithets at Boston Garden. That when white fans felt like he wasn't performing the way he was supposed to, he would hear all sorts of ugly slurs hurled at him. And also at one point, racists broke into his house in Massachusetts, and they destroyed his belongings, his trophies, and they painted the N-word on his bedroom wall. And so for him, his guard was always up, because he recognized that even though he was one of the most successful NBA players in America, that he was a famous man, that he was the most accomplished athlete in Boston, it didn't change the fact that he was a Black man. It didn't change the fact that some white folks, even in Boston, saw him as just another you-know-what. And so that hardened him. And so he had this contentious relationship with the city.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, good question. So what's happening now? 1964, 1965. Civil rights legislation is passed. The Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Now, these laws are designed, of course, to end racism and discrimination, but yet we know that structural inequalities persisted. At the same time, once the legal formal barriers against segregation were taken down, the challenges now for activists changed. The targets changed. And the movement fractured because, as I said a moment ago, you have a lot of young people, particularly in the urban north, who are questioning integration. They're questioning nonviolence. And what we see is that in this period, in 64, you have the Harlem race riots. In 65, we have the riots in Watts in a section of LA. And as Harry Edwards, who I'll talk about at length later, noted in his book, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, he explains that the roots of the revolt of the Black athlete spring from the same seed that produced the sit-ins, the freedom rides, and the rebellions in Watts, Detroit, and Newark. The revolt of the Black athlete also arises from his new awareness of his responsibilities in an increasingly more desperate, violent, and unstable America. What Harry Edwards identifies there is that the incredible racial unrest in America, particularly in the urban north and in the urban west, where we witness the majority of these racial confrontations, which often sprang from incidents of police brutality against black citizens, is that black folks in those cities had had enough. And if we listen to the words of Martin Luther King, who said that race riots is the language of the unheard. For black folks who were rising up in these cities, they were exacerbated. They felt unheard. They felt like the government didn't listen to them, that President Lyndon Johnson didn't listen to them, that the police did not protect them, and neither did the troops that were sent in these cities to quell these riots. Well, what's happening is that by 1966, when the phrase Black Power becomes a popular slogan, there's an increasing movement for Black Power activists to embrace more militant and confrontational positions, to seek autonomy, and to separate from white liberal activists. And so that is going to shape the revolt of the black athlete. Black nationalism and the Black Power movement, more than anything else, is going to shape the revolt of the black athlete. And we see that particularly in the story of Muhammad Ali. No black athlete had a greater influence on the revolt of the black athlete, a greater influence on other black athletes than Muhammad Ali. He gave other black athletes the courage, the power to speak out, to believe in their convictions, and to fight racial oppression. Now, in 1964, 2 years before Black Power became a popular rallying cry, the newly crowned heavyweight champion, still then known as Cassius Clay, announces in a press conference in Miami after he defeated Sonny Liston that he was not a Negro anymore, that he was not a Christian, that he did not believe in integration. He said that he was a proud black man, that he was a Muslim, and that he believed in the separation of the races. He said, quote, "I don't have to be what you want me to be. I'm free to be who I want." And what he meant by that, in this Declaration of Independence, is that he did not have to be an integrationist. He did not have to accept the old good Negro role popularized by Joe Louis, the great heavyweight champion of the 30s. He is breaking the shackles of the white sports establishment that expected black athletes to be seen and not heard. And in this moment, when he says, "I'm free to be who I want," he personified black power, and he redefined what it meant to be a black athlete. He said in 1965, "People are always telling me what a good example I could be if I just wasn't a Muslim. I've heard it over and over. How come I couldn't be like Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson? Well, they're gone now, and the black man's condition is just the same, ain't it? We're still catching hell." In other words, what Ali is saying here is that black athlete's success did not uplift black America. His success did not erase racism. And so Ali becomes an important symbol, an important voice in the eyes of many black Americans who saw him as a genuine revolutionary because he was authentic, because he was uncompromising. He became a Muslim. He changed his name. He spoke out against white supremacy and confronted the government because of his experience in a segregated country. For Ali, his role in the revolt of the black athlete changed in 1966. That's the year that his draft status changed from unqualified, because he hadn't passed a test, to reclassified as eligible. And it's in this moment where he becomes draft eligible. He's talking to a reporter, and he's scared. He's scared he's going to have to go into the military. He's scared about what's going to happen to him and about the future of his boxing career. And he just blurts out to a reporter, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." And it's in that moment that he became the first black celebrity to oppose the war. And when he's drafted and he refuses to enter the military, he risks everything. His title, his career, millions of dollars. And in the end, he would convince many skeptics that he was a man of principle, not just a tool for the Nation of Islam, a black nationalist religious sect that he belonged to. Well, you can see in this picture on the left, Ali there marching with police officers in 1967 at the Houston Induction Center. And on April 28th of that year, he refused induction into the U.S. Army on religious grounds, claiming that he objected to wars that were not declared by Allah, by his God. And immediately after he refused induction, the athletic commissions suspended his boxing license. The state commissions refused to let him fight. He was stripped of his title. And he essentially had lost his career and his title for taking a stand against the war. He was excoriated as being an insincere, unpatriotic, un-American draft dodger. He becomes a polarizing figure. And it's no exaggeration to say that he was the most hated black man in America. And yet, what's going to happen is as he faces this challenge, as he appeals his court case during 1967 and 1968, 1969, he'll become a race man, someone who is seen as an emblem of black empowerment. Now, Ali could have chosen an easy path like Joe Louis did during World War II. He could have fought in charity matches and made appearances with troops, but he refused to do so despite facing a 5-year prison sentence. Ali said, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville, his hometown, are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? If I thought the war was going to bring freedom and justice to my people, they wouldn't have to draft me. So I'll go to jail. We've been in jail for 400 years." In this statement, Ali made an assertion not just of black power, but also one of international solidarity with oppressed people around the world. It was a defiant statement, too. He was taking a position against the United States government. And for many black folks who admired Ali, they admired him even more so because he took a stand against Uncle Sam, against the establishment, against the government. Well, this was a controversial position because in 1967, there were still many, many Americans who supported America's position in Vietnam, including black Americans. In this picture, what we see is a profound moment where black athletes met with Ali in Cleveland. Now, in that front row, we can see on the far left, Bill Russell, then you have Ali, then you have Jim Brown, the Hall of Fame running back from the Cleveland Browns, and a young Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then known as Lou Alcindor. And in the back rows, we have a number of black NFL players who were there as well. And in this meeting, these black athletes met with Ali to show support, to offer advice, and to determine if he was sincere. And they recognized that Ali was sincere, that he believed that this war was unjust, and he was willing to make the sacrifice of going to prison because he believed in this cause. Well, this was significant, too, because this picture captures the first significant moment where black athletes unified across various sports behind a single cause. It represented this growing political solidarity among black athletes. And it also signaled a change. Before this, it was really black pro athletes who were speaking out. But the presence here of Lou Alcindor, the most famous college basketball player in America, marked a shift in the revolt of the black athlete from a select few professional athletes into the beginning of a movement defined by college athletes.
Johnny, I don't know if you know everyone in that image, but I'm struck by how the examples that we've been discussing so far come from major U.S. cities: New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, in a more contemporary way, Boston. Do you recognize any of those players to say which cities of the teams they play for are represented?
Boy, that's a good one. I don't have the list with me.
That's okay. I mean, I'm looking at it. It looks like Gale Sayers may be there. Is that right?
I don't know if that's Gale Sayers. I don't recall him being there, but I do know that Gale Sayers, since you mentioned him, way back when he was in college, I try to think if it's either the University of Kansas or Kansas State, where he was someone who participated in the sit-in. Yeah. And I think to your point, there's sort of 2 points I think of when I hear your question here, is that on the one hand, you see these black NFL players who are there because of Jim Brown. Jim Brown reached out to them, and I think a couple of them were from the Cleveland Browns, which makes sense. And it was also a number of other All-Pros who were there as well. These were guys who were recognizable in their hometowns. And I think that meant something, that these were all-stars in their sport. And so that sent a message that the press had to take this seriously. They laid the foundation for college athletes and lesser-known amateur athletes to follow in their footsteps. I think that's what is so significant here. When we think about the pantheon of black athletes, I mean, my goodness, Ali, Bill Russell, Jim Brown, Kareem, they're at the very top of the list.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Google machine gave me the answer. I don't know all these players: Carl Stokes, Walter Beach, Bobby Mitchell, Sid Williams, Curtis McClinton, Willie Davis, Jim Shorter, and John Wooten. But
Yeah.
it seems like they do represent a pretty broad geographic representation.
Yeah, Willie Davis played for the Green Bay Packers. Not a city necessarily known for its racial progressivism or for having a large black population. Certainly, though, Vince Lombardi made clear to his players, he would give them a speech. Lombardi was particularly sensitive as an Italian-American about prejudice and discrimination. And he would tell them he would not tolerate any racial epithets. He certainly wouldn't tolerate the N-word. He wouldn't tolerate his black players being mistreated. And he made his players understand, his white players in particular understand, look, you won't play for me if you have a problem with that. You'll be traded or you'll be cut. And so the culture is changing. Although a lot of white coaches couldn't identify with the experiences of their black players, they're forced to confront with the realities of their lives outside the boundaries of the field. And I think Lombardi and certainly John Wooden at UCLA, Lou Alcindor's coach, also recognized that he had to confront the fact that their players were dealing with these incredibly difficult situations when they weren't in uniform.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So let's talk about Lou Alcindor. My first book is called The Sons of Westwood, and it's about the UCLA basketball dynasty. I know we have a lot of LA teachers in the audience tonight. And when I wrote that book, I was really interested not just in how John Wooden built the most successful college basketball dynasty in history, really, 10 championships in 12 seasons, but I was particularly interested in Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's story. When he goes to UCLA, he's still known as Lou Alcindor, and he goes there and he dominates on the court. If you had a chance to read my piece in The Undefeated, then maybe you're more familiar with his career, but he leads UCLA to 3 national championships. But at the same time, he really becomes the face of the college revolt of the black athlete because he is one of the most famous athletes in America, pro or collegiate. He is a celebrity who has graced the cover of all sorts of magazines, not just sports magazines. He's been on television. He's been a celebrity since his late teen years. When he goes to UCLA, and having gone to the Cleveland Summit, he recognizes that he wants to use his platform as the most famous college basketball player in America to speak out against racism. And I think what's significant about Alcindor and Tommie Smith and John Carlos and these other black collegians is that they belong to a new generation of black college athletes who believed they had an obligation to join the freedom struggle. They had come to realize that the civil rights legislation had not cured the country's disease of racism, and that their accomplishments in the sports world had done little to change the conditions in black America. And so that is significant here. Now, for Alcindor, as a young man, a teenager, 1964, he's from New York, he's 17 years old, he sees firsthand what became known as the Harlem Race Riots, which began when a white off-duty cop shot a young black boy. And then in 1965, the summer of 1965, right before Lou Alcindor arrives on campus at UCLA in Westwood, the Watts riots erupt, again as a result of police brutality. And these urban rebellions radicalized a lot of, or many I should say, young black Americans who had come of age in these cities. And it was no different for Alcindor. For him, he gravitated toward the messages of Malcolm X, not Martin Luther King. Malcolm X, who was murdered in February of 1965, had presented this message of self-determination, black nationalism, racial pride, independence for black people. And that's what Alcindor gravitated toward. At the same time, 1967, at San Jose State in California, there's a contingent of track athletes, great track athletes, including Tommie Smith, John Carlos, who I mentioned before, and Lee Evans, another Olympian, who began discussing this idea of boycotting the Olympic Games in Mexico City in 1968 to demonstrate against racism in America at large. That they were not initially thinking they were going to demonstrate against racism in sports. In fact, Tommie Smith and Lee Evans had distanced themselves from Black power politics. They didn't see themselves as radicals or militants. But the fact is that when Tommie Smith gave an interview in the fall of 1967 and he mentioned this as a possibility, he was immediately criticized. He was immediately charged with being ungrateful because all of what sports had given him. He was being charged with being unpatriotic. He received hate mail and death threats. But nonetheless, Tommie Smith, John Carlos, Lee Evans, they had conversations with this man, Harry Edwards. Harry Edwards was an instructor at San Jose State University in sociology. And in the fall of 1967, Edwards and the Black Student Union at San Jose State, they organized a protest movement on campus. They demanded an end to discrimination. They asked also for better treatment of Black athletes. They made the point that only Black athletes were recruited to the university, not Black students. And Harry Edwards will become really the architect, the organizing force behind the Olympic Project for Human Rights and the proposed boycott of the 1968 Olympic Games. Now, Harry Edwards is fascinating. This is a man who's a former college athlete. He stood 6'8", 240 pounds. He's an imposing figure, and he consciously cultivated this image. You look at this image here compared to the one I have on the previous slide, where he looks professorial. He's got the sweater and the jacket and the reading glasses. And then the next image, he's got the beret and the black jacket and the matches on his jacket and the black sunglasses and the goatee, and he looks like he's cultivated consciously this image of a Black Panther, of a Black Power radical. And the fact is that his hero, like Lou Alcindor and Muhammad Ali at one point as well, was Malcolm X. He had studied the words of Malcolm X. He had modeled himself after Malcolm X, who was a skillful, provocative orator. Now, here's what Harry Edwards says. You can see these quotes. What value is it to a Black man to win a medal if he returns to be relegated to the hell of Harlem? It's time for the auction block to come down. Black masculinity is no longer for sale. This language that Edwards used really emphasized this idea that Black athletes, in his view, had been exploited. Men had been emasculated by the white sports establishment. And the proper response, in his view, as Malcolm X said, was to use whatever means necessary to gain freedom for Black people. And he recognized that just because the achievements of a select few Black athletes did exist, that it did little to erase racial injustice. This is the theme of the revolt. And he also understood that Black athletes possessed real power in America. Collectively, they could use that power, use that leverage to define themselves beyond the athletic field. So, in the fall of 1967, he organizes a workshop around a proposed boycott of the 1968 Olympic Games. Tommie Smith was there, Lee Evans, and Lou Alcindor. This meeting took place in Los Angeles on Thanksgiving in 1967. And what happens at this event is of some debate. Something that I need to point out here. If we think about the language that Edwards used, it's time for the auction block to come down. Black masculinity is no longer for sale. You see, Black women were not invited to participate in this workshop. They were not invited to participate in the Olympic Project for Human Rights. This movement, much like the Black Power movement, was framed around the redemption of Black manhood. It privileged Black manhood, while ignoring the important roles of Black women in the freedom struggle. So in this meeting, Black athletes discussed during the workshop the case for a boycott. and athletes had conflicting views. There was no consensus. However, long story short, there was disturbance outside the church where this took place, and it forced Edwards to have a roll call vote instead of a private vote. And in the end, after Lou Alcindor gives this speech, which I'll read to you in a second, Edwards claimed that there was a consensus that 50 to 60 black athletes agreed that they should boycott the 1968 Olympic Games. But the truth was there was no real agreement for a boycott. But what Alcindor said that day seemed to inspire a lot of the black athletes in attendance. He said, "Everybody knows me. I'm the big basketball star, the weekend hero, everybody's All-American. Well, last summer, I was almost killed by a racist cop shooting at a black cat in Harlem. He was shooting on the street where masses of black people were standing around or just taking a walk, but he didn't care. After all, we are just a bunch of..." Somewhere, each of us has got to take a stand against this kind of thing. This is how I make my stand, using what I have, and I take my stand here. Now, keep in mind that Lou Alcindor, I think, is probably 21 years old in this moment when he gives this speech. And he's a college student. And yet he also recognized that he has this burden on his shoulders to use his celebrity for a larger mission in the larger struggle. Now, the fact is that after he makes the speech inside that church that day, and then he has to come out and talk to the press, he's uncomfortable. Because now the press, all they want to talk about is the fact that Lou Alcindor, the most important player for the U.S. Olympic basketball team, is talking about refusing to play in protest against racism in America, and some of the most dominant black athletes on the U.S. Olympic team, particularly the track team, are also talking about not competing in Mexico City. Keep in mind that before 1968, black athletes had won a third of gold medals in track and field events, and they were vital to the U.S. Olympic track team as well, going into the 68 games. So this becomes the major story. It's on the front page of magazines, newspapers, and at the core of this story, I think, is a tension around what it means to be an American. You know, as Malcolm X said in one of his most important speeches to a black audience, he said, if you were an American, you wouldn't need civil rights legislation. You wouldn't need a civil rights bill. You know, there's no civil rights legislation for white people. And so here at the core here is this tension also for young black Americans who could relate to the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, the Souls of Black Folk, who wrote of this double consciousness, this sort of conflicting tension between being a black person and being an American, and looking at yourself through the eyes of others, through the eyes of white people. And it's in this moment that white critics are questioning the patriotism of these black athletes.
Johnny, let me ask you to clarify, or maybe to spend a little bit more time on that particular point. Athletes today, LeBron James, Colin Kaepernick, they can provide an unfiltered view of their voice and their perspective through social media. And what you're describing back then is that these athletes, even if they controlled their own message, it still had to be filtered through a reporter or a newspaper editor or a television announcer. How different was it to have, whether it's diluted or represented accurately? I'm sure there are examples of both, but how did their lack of direct communication with the general public about their intentions, how did it affect them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, you bring up a good point that today, most prominent athletes, they can control the message, whether it's the Players Tribune, which is a platform started by Derek Jeter where athletes could write long pieces and op-eds, or through their own Twitter accounts or Instagram, or in the case of LeBron James, who has his own production company. So we're living in a totally different age where they have more autonomy to disseminate their message. And they can go around the press in some ways. In the late 60s, of course, that was not the case. The dominant way that Americans consume their sports coverage was through newspapers on a daily basis, television reports, and the radio. And so for Lou Alcindor and Bill Russell, those are two examples that instantly come to mind, is that it was difficult to have these conversations with what were mostly older white men who simply could not understand how these young black men, who in their mind had the best world possible, sports had given them so much. That was the language that was used, that sports were free of racial discrimination. How is it that black athletes of all people would have any reason to complain, any reason to protest? And so there's this immediate barrier, I think, is the way I picture it, that there's a barrier for these black athletes in the late 60s to speak out, to make sure that their message is heard clearly, because their message would be distorted. In fact, there were white writers who would accuse Lou Alcindor and Tommie Smith of being black racists or black supremacists. Brent Musburger would famously write an op-ed calling Tommie Smith and John Carlos, after the '68 demonstration, black stormtroopers, comparing them to Nazis. And so the vitriol, the backlash, which I'm going to discuss more here in a moment, it was significant. There were white alumni at UCLA who wanted the university to revoke Alcindor's scholarship, to ban him from the university. And so it was incredibly, incredibly difficult. And they put their lives on the line in many ways.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it really does just continue to underscore the true courage and dedication those athletes you're discussing now had. Thank you for addressing that.
Yeah. So the next piece in the puzzle here that I want to mention that is often forgotten is Martin Luther King Jr. In 1967, in December of 1967, he and Harry Edwards held a press conference in New York City. And this press conference was important for a couple of reasons. The first reason it was important is that the Olympic Project for Human Rights announced 6 or 7 demands, if you will. And the demands included the restoration of Muhammad Ali's heavyweight championship title, his boxing license, his right to box in America, the removal of Avery Brundage as the president of the International Olympic Committee. Harry Edwards and other critics argued that Avery Brundage was racist and anti-Semitic. They also called for an end to discrimination against black folks and Jewish Americans by the New York Athletic Commission. And they also, I think really significantly, demanded the barring of South Africa and Rhodesia from Olympic competition because they practiced apartheid. So this movement was in many ways altruistic, and it was international in scope. When we think about, in particular, this call to bar South Africa and Rhodesia from the Olympic Games, which they would be actually, and that would later undercut the boycott movement. I'll explain why. But back to King. King's presence at this press conference, when Harry Edwards announces this list of demands, gave the movement credibility and also greater visibility. Now, what we have to understand about Martin Luther King in this moment is that he's not popular among white America. A Gallup poll the previous year had showed that about 2/3 of Americans disapproved of him and his actions. And another poll that year showed that 85% of white people believed that civil rights demonstrations hurt the advancement of civil rights. So let's keep that in perspective here. By 66, 67, 2/3 of Americans disapproved of King, who by then had organized this multi-ethnic poor people's campaign. And by April of 1967, he came out against the Vietnam War. He criticized the administration of Lyndon Johnson, and he took a lot of flack for that, even within the civil rights community. So King's popularity is waning, but he believes in this cause. And when he's at this press conference with Harry Edwards, he says, "This is a protest and a struggle against racism and injustice, and that is what we are working to eliminate in our organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and in our total struggle." King praised the athletes who are willing to sacrifice their Olympic dreams in order to help those who remained impoverished or segregated, or faced discrimination. So this is, I think, a remarkable moment that is often forgotten in the career and activism of Martin Luther King, is that he began to see the important role of sports in the civil rights movement. Before we start, Andy, you mentioned that for many of our teachers tonight, that perhaps this lecture wouldn't necessarily fit into their traditional curriculum, and that's probably true for a lot of people. But here's what I would argue as a historian who studies, teaches, and writes about sports history, and that is this. Number one, sports history is American history. I hope this lecture demonstrates that point. And number two is that you cannot teach African American history without teaching sports history. I don't think you can teach African American history without talking about Jack Johnson and Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali in particular. I think those four figures really help define American racial politics at the height of their careers. And so I think there are ways, and we can talk about this later, to integrate parts of this material into your courses. But what we're seeing here, I think, with the presence of King and the activism of these athletes, is that the Black freedom struggle was connected to the sports world. They were intertwined. And as I mentioned a moment ago, and when Andy asked me about the press, this is major news. And it has a significant effect on the way that sports writers cover sports. The Revolt of the Black Athlete changed the nature of sports writing. It forced writers, particularly white writers, to ask new questions, to examine their own assumptions about sports racial progressivism. It also, this coverage in Sports Illustrated and Sport Magazine and Newsweek and on television, it shaped the nation's racial consciousness. Increasingly, white Americans viewed Black athletes, though, as militants and malcontents, and that produced a backlash. In this period, as I mentioned a moment ago, when increasingly white Americans have grown tired of civil rights demonstrations and of confrontations in the cities between police and activists and the urban rebellions, many whites viewed this boycott movement as not just unpatriotic, but nonsensical. They failed to understand that what motivated these young Black men and the purpose behind their ideas. And many writers argued that if there was one area in America where discrimination was least prevalent, it was sports. So that is a tension point here. Now, ultimately, what's going to happen is that the 1968 Olympic Games, they take place in Mexico City in October of that year, and there is no boycott. There was never a coherent, unified movement for a boycott. And what I think is interesting about this is that Tommie Smith and Lee Evans and Lou Alcindor as well, they never really encouraged other Black athletes to boycott the games. They weren't even sure if there would be a boycott. When they were asked by reporters over the course of the year whether there would be a boycott, they sort of went back and forth. They were unsure about whether this strategy would accomplish the goals that Harry Edwards outlined. I mean, if you look back at that list of demands that Edwards made in New York City with Martin Luther King, the fact is that a boycott didn't give them any leverage in accomplishing any of them for the most part. And so, in the end, what Black athletes decided to do in Mexico City was protest as individuals. And that's why we get Tommie Smith and John Carlos on the victory stand in 1968, raising their fists in a Black Power salute. But what I have to emphasize here is that when they did this, it was not spontaneous. They had this racial consciousness, they saw themselves as activists, and they gave thought to what this gesture was going to mean. Now, there's conflicting accounts about who actually planned this demonstration. Smith and Carlos have given different versions over the years, so we don't have a ton of clarity. But I think we have some clues in this quote. Immediately after they delivered this demonstration on the victory stand, Tommie Smith explained, "My raised right hand stood for the power in Black America. Carlos's raised left hand stood for the unity in Black America. Together they formed an arch of unity and power. The black scarf around my neck stood for Black pride. The black socks with no shoes stood for Black poverty in racist America. The totality of our effort was the regaining of Black dignity. If you think about what he says there, I mean, it's to absorb it, you can see that this gesture was incredibly well thought out, and it's a articulate answer. He defends every move here. Every article of clothing has a purpose in many ways. John Carlos, on the other hand, when he was asked about it, gave sort of standard comments, standard rhetoric. It was never this specific. The fact is, too, is that, and overlooked in this, is that Tommie Smith's wife bought the black gloves a day earlier. She was the one who bought the gloves when she saw that another Black Olympian the day before had refused to shake hands with Avery Brundage. Again, he was the IOC president, who many accused of being racist, and that inspired her. So what you don't see on the stand, of course, is a woman, but it was Tommie Smith's wife behind the scenes who played a role in shaping a gesture, this image that would endure for decades. Now note that Tommie Smith did not use the phrase Black Power. He used the phrase the power in Black America. He was very careful about the language he used. He did not want to use the phrase Black Power, which frightened many Americans who associated that phrase with revolution and violence. But the fact is, this protest, it was disruptive, it was seen as subversive, but it was peaceful, and it was silent. And it was powerful because Smith and Carlos, again, they're redefining how Black athletes protested. They asserted their freedom to demonstrate where they wanted and how they wanted, much in the way that Colin Kaepernick would later when he initiated the Take a Knee movement. He took a knee within the sports arena. Now, the consequence of this, of course, for Smith and Carlos, is they were kicked out of the Olympic Village. They were suspended by the IOC, and the critical news media in the United States, like the New York Times, claimed that this demonstration was, quote, disgraceful, insulting, and embarrassing. But
John, can you take a moment and talk about Peter Norman, who is the white man there, the third place finisher? I believe he was from Australia, which at the time had apartheid laws almost as strict as South Africa, and I'm pretty sure that he expressed support of the two. Is that correct?
That's right. You can see there in the picture, but I don't know if you can see my arrow there, but there's a button on his jacket, and that was an Olympic Project for Human Rights button. He has it, Tommie Smith has it, and John Carlos has it. They're all wearing the button. And you think about how remarkable that is. And the fact is that when Peter Norman returned to Australia, he received a lot of criticism for this, that he was standing up there with these radicals, these Black militants. But he stood there in solidarity with them. He expressed messages about supporting social justice and racial justice all around the world. And I think it's important that people know the story of Peter Norman as well, and that there he was, in this moment, a silver medalist who embraced this cause from these two Black Americans. I think it's a pretty powerful story, and that we see, too, how this was not just an American story or an American protest, but it was one with international implications. And keep in mind, too, this is the Cold War. Okay, so what that means is that in the late 1960s, that during the Cold War, the Olympic Games were not just an international event, and they weren't just sporting events. They were a battle for ideological supremacy between the United States and the Soviets, a struggle between two ideologies. And so the United States and the Soviets, they saw these games as a competition to prove the superiority of their systems. And so that context was not lost on the nation states, the U.S. Olympic Committee. And the other fact here is that in the past, the U.S. Olympic Committee and the State Department, our government, promoted the success of Black athletes, took them on these tours, and held them up as symbols of democracy. Now, of course, in the previous years, in the early 60s and in the 50s, when this began, when the State Department began these tours, there was clear hypocrisy that the government wanted to use these athletes and portray them as symbols of racial progress. But the Soviets weaponized the media coverage in the United States, the events taking place in Birmingham and throughout the South, and they showed that equality did not exist for Black Americans. This is something I write about in my book, Blood Brothers, about Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, that when Cassius Clay was an Olympian in 1960, he toes the party line. He delivers the patriotic line when he's interviewed by a Soviet reporter. He talks about how America is the greatest country in the world, including yours. He says this as an 18-year-old to a Soviet reporter at the Rome Olympics in 1960. But if you fast forward to 1964, when he's Muhammad Ali and he travels to Africa, he's critical of the United States. He's critical of the U.S. government. So these Black athletes are undermining U.S. foreign policy.
Great. Thank you for addressing that.
Yeah. Okay, so Tommie Smith, John Carlos, they're kicked out of the Olympic Village. They're criticized when they come back to the United States. But here's the thing. Here's what I think the real value of their protest and even the Olympic boycott movement, even though there wasn't a boycott. I think the legacy of 1968 that is important here is that they created a path and a template for other Black athletes to join the revolt, to become activists themselves. And that occurred, throughout 1968, 1969, into the early 70s. In fact, over the course of 1968 and 1969, there were over 36 protests by Black college athletes at predominantly white schools. At multiple schools, these Black athletes complained about racism that they experienced on campus. They talked about racism within athletic departments. They demanded more Black coaches, Black academic advisors, better living conditions off campus. They confronted a host of issues. Well, in response to that, and I think this is one of the important legacies of the revolt of the Black athlete, the college sports establishment, namely the NCAA, wants to regain control of the athletic world. And they do that by asserting greater control over college athletes' political activism. In 1969, as I note here on this slide, the NCAA passed a rule that allowed any member institution to, quote, terminate the financial aid of a student athlete if he is adjudged to have been guilty of manifest disobedience through violations or established athletic department policies and rules applicable to all student athletes. Manifest disobedience. Well, what the hell does that mean? What it meant was college athletic administrators, coaches now had the ability to punish by terminating athletic scholarships an athlete who defied the authority of coaches, who broke athletic department rules, who participated in demonstrations that were disapproved of by athletic departments and coaches. And so this was a way that the NCAA and the college sports establishment regained leverage over these college athletes. And in fact, Walter Byers is pictured there, the executive director of the NCAA. He wrote an op-ed where he claimed that the Black Panthers and other radicals, the American Communist Party, the Students for Democratic Society, were trying to recruit college athletes, and not just Black athletes, but white athletes too, to destroy college sports. And so this was seen as a crisis in the world of college athletics. And in fact, as I also note on the slide, 4 years later in 1973, the NCAA changed athletic scholarships from a guaranteed 4-year offer to a renewable 1-year commitment. And so the message here that I also have on the slide is, shut up and play ball. You're not here to engage in anti-war demonstrations or the New Left or Black Power organizations. You're here to practice, play, go to class, and keep your mouth shut. And so we see here that this is part of the legacy of the revolt of the Black athlete, this conservative backlash against the activism of these athletes. I want to save time for questions. My last slide is this image, this cover of the New Yorker, which I love. It's an image of Colin Kaepernick and, oh gosh, now I'm drawing a blank on the player from the Seattle Seahawks. Forgive me, linking arms with Martin Luther King Jr., and this image of Serena Williams on the tennis court raising her fist in what is known as a Black Power salute. And so I'm going to stop there so that we can talk about anything you want, really, but also if you want to discuss some of the parallels between 1968 and what's happening over the last few years as Black athletes have joined the movement for social justice in larger numbers than even during the late 1960s.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I'll remind our audience that you can submit questions for discussion using the Ask Professor Smith tab, which should be just underneath the audience chat that you've been using. I've got one question for you, Johnny, while our audience gets their fingers ready and types in their question. Talk to us a little bit about athletes really in any era. You can certainly start in the mid-60s and move to the present, who have a decidedly silent voice. And of course, the person who comes to mind most notably is Michael Jordan and his reluctance to get involved in North Carolina politics in the early 90s. To talk to us some about whether it's backlash or just the role that they play by not being involved.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what we start to see is two things happening, I think, that changed this sort of silent era, if you will, that really begins, I think, in the 70s and continues through the 80s and 90s. And the two events that I see that change conditions for Black athletes in terms of their political activism is free agency, which takes place in professional sports in the 70s. And what that did is a couple of things. One is it grew, on the one hand, the economic opportunities and the salaries, of course, for all athletes, but in particular for prominent Black athletes. And so the stakes financially were greater for many of them, who also, by the age of O.J. Simpson in the late 70s, and then later with Jordan in the 80s and into the 90s with Nike and Coca-Cola and McDonald's, endorsement opportunities, that there were real financial repercussions. Now, there were some Black athletes besides OJ in the late 70s who had some endorsement opportunities like Julius Erving and Red Jackson. But as Julius Erving said in an interview that I read, he recognized that when he came to the NBA, he had played in the ABA, he had the big afro, and he was really a symbol of the Black Power era. He trimmed his afro, he trimmed the goatee, wore the mustache, and he said he needed to go for that more corporate look. It was a conscious decision by Dr. J to embrace corporate America so that he would become more acceptable by white Americans. And a lot of people forget, too, that if you read Michael Jordan's autobiography, he says that the Black basketball player that he patterned himself after, not just on the court, but off the court, was Dr. J. And so I think that's really interesting that he saw this kind of connection, this role model in Julius Erving, who we often forget. Okay, so on the one hand, in the 70s, we see that free agency changes the economics. We also see the rise in opportunities in terms of endorsement deals. And of course, a lot of Black athletes were leery of losing those financial opportunities. But perhaps more importantly is that the Black Power movement by the mid-70s, certainly late 70s, it fractures, it dissolves. The organizations are broken up. And as Harry Edwards points out, that really the dominant thrust from 1975 through, say, 2005, is there was no dominant Black ideology that could hold together a movement, right? So what we see in the late 60s is that the Black Power movement really inspires and energizes the revolt of the Black athlete. And what we see here today in the last 3 or 5 years is that, more than that actually, more than 5 years now, but in a more recent memory is that the Black Lives Matter movement has really energized the examples we've seen from LeBron James and Colin Kaepernick and the women in the WNBA who have also been at the forefront of this as well.
That's a great answer. Thank you. We have some questions that have come in, so I'm going to share these with you one at a time. Let's start with Raina. Raina asks, were there any women that were part of this movement? What kind of role did African-American women play?
Yeah, so as I said briefly, they were a couple of things to keep in mind. One is there's no pro sports for women in 1968 besides tennis, really. You have a movement that is developing, led by Billie Jean King, a white woman, when tennis was basically all white on the women's circuit. You have Arthur Ashe, a prominent black star on the men's circuit. But women's pro-tennis circuit really doesn't come into fruition until around 1969, 1970. But outside of that, there's not a WNBA. Female track stars are not getting media attention as well. I think we have to keep in mind is that the sports world is still not only just segregated, but there's a patriarchy. And the newsrooms operated by that same patriarchy. And so what the reporters are doing is they're going to the male athletes to ask these questions. They're not going to the women. They're not asking them what they think. The women are marginalized. They're marginalized in society. They're marginalized within these social action groups, and they were marginalized within the Olympic Project for Human Rights. But here's what we should keep in mind. A change is going to come. As Sam Cooke said, and particularly for women, that the women's liberation movement that begins in the late 60s, we think about the Miss America beauty pageant protest that took place in Atlantic City in 1968, raised the consciousness of women all across the country. And so in growing numbers, the feminist movement is going to shape all sorts of parts of American life, including sports. Title IX is passed in 1972. Billie Jean King has fought for equal pay for women in tennis, pro tennis. And so those changes are starting to take place. But the short answer is that women were not considered by the men who were asking the questions in the media to be important enough in this conversation. And the male athletes and Harry Edwards didn't also include them in these discussions. Now, there were black women at the Olympic Games like Wyoma Tyus, who showed solidarity. Wyoma Tyus was a track and field star. She wore a black armband at Mexico City, but nobody remembers Wyoma Tyus. There's no picture of her that we've seen shown over and over and over again, like one of Tommie Smith and John Carlos. And so, again, I just try to emphasize to students that the voices that are held up then were largely the male voices. And a lot of that has to do with the sexism and the discrimination of the times.
Great. This question is from Deborah. Deborah, who is somewhere in Chapel Hill with me and at UNC in the Department of Health Behavior. Deborah is asking the following. The NIL proposed legislation that allows external companies to pay athletes. However, the NCAA has still not changed its position to pay athletes. What do you, Johnny Smith, think about NCAA member institutions paying athletes?
Oh, man. Deborah, this is a great question. This is one I could get talking about for a long time. So here's my view. I believe that the NCAA operates as a cartel. And what I mean by that is that the member schools have chosen to place a cap on the compensation of college athletes and create restrictions on their financial compensation in the form of a scholarship, room and board, and a little top-off money for food. But the fact is that everybody in college athletics operates by capitalistic principles, a free market. The athletic directors, the coaches, the media members, the television networks, the staff, all of them, none of them have their economic opportunities restricted. The coaches are not asked to act as amateur coaches, right? They are treated as professionals. And what has happened over the course of the last few decades in particular, as the television revenues have grown exponentially, is that the NCAA and the member schools have created what I would describe as a wealth transfer system. And what I mean by that is that the coaching staffs in football and in basketball and the administrative staffs in athletic departments have expanded, and their compensation has grown as well. The other thing that has happened as well is as this has become a multi-billion-dollar business, when we're talking about college football television revenues and the March Madness contract for men's basketball, is that the monies, they go not only into the salaries of coaches and athletic directors and administrators, but that money is also spent in the infrastructure, in the stadiums, in the locker rooms. And what I would tell those athletes who play for those teams who are maybe impressed by their shiny new locker room toys is that those locker rooms that are renovated, those big glossy television sets in the fancy weight rooms, they're not for the guys who are there using them. They're for the recruits, because these college athletic departments have to spend the revenue to continue this idea that they are a nonprofit. But the fact remains that everybody's profiting off of a capitalist system except for the athletes. And when I've gotten into this conversation with some people, I make this argument that these athletes, particularly in these revenue sports, who are disproportionately black in football and in men's basketball, I say they are exploited. And people will say, well, wait a minute, they get a scholarship, they get their tuition waiver, they get all this stuff. The colleges do all of this for them. Well, my counterpoint to them is that, well, they're exploited because, in the words of Marvin Miller, exploitation. Marvin Miller was the head of the Major League Baseball Players Association. Marvin Miller said that exploitation is the difference between what you are worth and what you are compensated. And we have economists who have documented that the true economic value of individual college basketball players in the men's division and college football players, they're worth far more than what they get on an annual basis. But again, their compensation is capped. And the reason for that is because the people who benefit most from the current system, who profit from the system, are not interested in reforming that system.
It sounds like you're saying yes, they should.
Yes, they should be compensated, yeah.
Yeah, of course. And as you look through the infrastructure of college athletics, the revenue that they generate, and by the way, we're also talking about the alternative economy. Who knows how many bazillions of dollars are wagered in sports halls across the country and in Las Vegas. I'm reminded of the story Chris Webber told of standing in a McDonald's in the early 90s when he played for the University of Michigan as one of the Fab Four and Fab Five, and standing behind a kid who was wearing his $80 Weber jersey while Weber couldn't even scrape together enough money to get a Big Mac. So, I mean, there really is that significant difference. And so I guess as a follow-up question to Deborah's question is, how has the revolt of the black athlete considered and addressed college sports as well? So is there evidence of, or are there examples of athletes, whether they're professional or college, other than the strike that was considered a few years ago? What are they doing about it?
Yeah, we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, I don't know exactly what month it is now, this last year has been a blur, but that there were there was a coalition of football players in the Pac-12 conference who organized, and they had a list of demands that they would not return to practice or to games unless they were reassured that their health was being protected, and they had other economic justice demands as well along these this point of the NIL. And so I think that conversation is growing. I don't think, though, that in other conferences we've seen as strong of a coalition movement take place where these college football players and basketball players in particular recognize how much power they have. I mean, that's the thing here, is that there's this incredibly large untapped power that these college athletes hold, and they have to figure out how to use it if they want to facilitate real change. Now, I also think that there's a lot of young men who are afraid to challenge the system, and for good reason, right? They dream, for many years of their young lives that they're going to go play at a big-time school, and they're going to be in, the SEC, or they're going to play basketball at UNC or Duke or whatever. And that's the dream. And they hope that will take them to the next stage. And they don't want to be seen as a troublemaker. And they don't want to have problems with their coach or lose their scholarship or lose their playing time. And so they're They're less willing to take that risk. Now, what I'm interested to see here, though, is that I do think the examples we've seen from our professional men and women in the sports world, like LeBron James and Serena Williams, and a host of WNBA stars as well, is that maybe that's going to encourage college athletes to draw a line in the stand. The other thing that we should think about, too, is this pandemic, I think, illustrates perfectly how exploited college football players are. You know, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, that at UNC at one point, they sent the student body home, but yet the football players, again, a team that is disproportionately black, they stayed on campus. They still practiced. They still played. So let's ask ourselves, are the players on the Tar Heel college football team, are they students first, as the NCAA keeps telling us? Are they amateur athletes, as the NCAA keeps telling us? Or are they professionals whose labor services are dictated and controlled by the administration there? I would argue it's the latter. They didn't have the same, they were not treated the same as the rest of the student body. That is a fact. And I think that until we reconcile that, and until the athletes themselves are willing to confront that issue and defend themselves and defend their health as well as their financial well-being, the status quo will continue to play out. Because the fact of the matter is, the coaches, they're not going to change the system, because the coaches benefit from the system more than anybody. So they can make speeches and talk about, well, I believe in racial justice. Well, the fact of the matter is that pay the players is a racial justice issue. It is a social justice issue. Think about this, that for many of these young men who play football and basketball at the collegiate level, they're not going to become pros. The majority of them are not going to become pros. That means that their collegiate career is the point in which their market value is the highest. Now, not all of them would get paid in an open market $100,000 a year. That's not what I'm saying. But many of them would have an opportunity to get endorsements, to negotiate those services. And then what does that mean for them and their families? Well, it would mean they could take that money, put it into an investment account, put it into a down payment on a house, right? And what we've seen since 1968, and one reason that so many black people are frustrated with the persistence of inequality, is there's been no real progress for black Americans in terms of the percentage of home ownership of their wealth. And so to me, I think about this issue of paying the players as an economic justice issue, as a social justice issue, and a racial justice issue for those reasons.
Really great response. Thank you, Johnny. We're almost out of time. I've got one last question for you. I'm going to put you on the spot, and it's not going to be fair. And I fully understand that this question has flaws in it. But either of the activists that you've talked about tonight, or perhaps one that you have not covered in tonight's session, in your view, who has had the deepest impact? Who has really had significant impact in change and in causing a reaction to, and I mean reaction in a good way, in reaction to the issues of the day?
You mean historically, or are you talking about like our present culture?
I'll let you pick. In the last 50 years, whether you go all the way back to Bill Russell, I'm gonna be even more restrictive and say not Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Who do you think really has like an unrecognized, just deep impact?
Oh, an unrecognized. Okay. Gosh, that is a really good question. Elgin Baylor comes to mind. Here's why. Elgin Baylor, for those of you who may not know, he's a Hall of Fame NBA player. He's played for the Lakers, comes of age in the late 50s and into the 60s. In 1960, Elgin Baylor and a group of black ball players, black NBA players, they were playing in West Virginia during an exhibition game. So again, keep in mind, 1960 is the year of the sit-ins, when the sit-ins began in Greensboro, North Carolina, by college students. And in West Virginia, Elgin Baylor and a couple other, I think it was 2 black teammates, They confronted these racist encounters when they were there, and they refused to play. And I think that we have to remember that this decision, long before he's a Hall of Fame player, to refuse to play, I forget which town it was bold. It was daring. It was risky. He was risking his career. And we don't look back and we think about Elgin Baylor as, in the same regard as, say, Bill Russell, as an outspoken black athlete, or like Oscar Robertson, who would lead the NBA players' quest for free agency. So I think that part of his story is important. And as I said, it is often overlooked. And it was so unprecedented in many ways, to basically have a walkout, right? These guys said, we're not going to play. It's a story that I think that is long forgotten. But Elgin Baylor is fascinating in some ways, too, because after he retires from the NBA, he'll go on to become a general manager in the NBA for the Los Angeles Clippers. I don't believe he was not the first black GM, but he was among the first. And so think about that legacy, for Baylor, that his activism as a young player, and then he goes to gain a position of power in the NBA. And I think the NBA is sort of interesting in that regard, to see how, in my mind, the NBA today is of the professional sports league, it's the strongest for black athletes, in that they have the strongest players union, and the athletes have the most economic empowerment. And they've been able to use that. And we saw that on full display just a few months ago, when a number of teams were supposed to start playing, and they decided, in the aftermath of another heinous police killing of a young black man, that they weren't going to play. And they held this walkout. And LeBron James talked to President Obama about, how they could use this moment constructively, because they didn't believe that, they didn't want to send a message that they were boycotting the NBA, because their issue was not with the NBA. The issue was not with the owners or with Adam Silver, the commissioner. And they came up with this idea that they were going to use this as an opportunity to facilitate real change. And what did we get out of that? The repurposing of our NBA arenas and our other professional sports arenas, which often are empty when there aren't sporting events taking place or concerts. And I think that's where you see something new happening right now. And it's part of the legacy of Elgin Baylor and Bill Russell and Muhammad Ali. And LeBron James has taken up the mantle, and so many others. And we're seeing how they're using their power, their economic power and their political power and their cultural power, to change this country. LeBron James organized a voter registration drive. They registered tens of thousands of people who then voted. That is participating in a democracy that is empowering individual people, ordinary people, in significant ways. And as we know, voting is habitual. So for those young people in particular, or people who are voting for the first time, they're going to participate in the next major election. And so I think that's, you can connect these threads from the past to the present.
Johnny Smith, it's always a pleasure. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We appreciate your insights. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Same to you. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
I want to thank our entire audience for joining us tonight. I do encourage you to follow the National Humanities Center website, as well as our social media. Facebook and Twitter is where you can see and find upcoming activities and opportunities. We're taking next week off, so we'll see you again after the holiday. December 3rd is our next scheduled webinar. We'll be joined by Scott Newstock from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. The title of that session is How to Think Like Shakespeare. Have a great end of the week, and moving into the holiday season. Please be well, and we'll see you next time in our National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.
Can you hear me, Andy? I don't know what happened.
Yeah, hit your mute button.
Oh, there we go. I hope that was good.
Hey, Johnny, you're live right now. Hit your mute button.
Oh, okay. Let's see.